Fossils of plants and animals show powerful evidence for a recent creation.
At the same time, many fossils give a great challenge to the concept of evolution in millions of years.
Fossils and creation, today on Creation Magazine Live.
Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. My name is Calvin Smith.
And I'm Richard Fangrad.
And today we're going to talk about fossils.
Yes.
And usually when people think of fossils, they equate them with evolution.
Yes.
In a sense, right?
All over the place.
I remember seeing one skeptic t-shirt. It says, "We have the fossils, we win." it was like that simple in his mind. But anyway, what we're going to look at today is the nature of the fossil record, and what you're going to see is it actually fits in quite well with what the Bible talks about a global flood.
It does fit well. But before we get to the fossils, let's think about how fossils relate to Christianity. Fossils are dead things. And if we think of death, well, death entered the world as a result of sin, the Bible says. So if fossils are dead things, then Christ dies to pay for sin. We have a link between sin and death there.
Right.
That was established back in Genesis. Death was supposed to come into the world as a result of sin.
Right.
Now, fossils are dead things.
Right. So, when we look at some key passages in Scripture, Romans 5:12 says, "Therefore, through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin. So Adam brought death into the world through sin." And verses like Genesis 1:29 and 30, when we look at them, it says that when God gave commands about what everything was to eat in the beginning, everything was eating plants. And yet in the fossil record, we find records of creatures killing one another. So if the fossils got laid down before Adam sinned, we've got death before sin. This is a huge challenge to our theology. We've discussed this many times.
Yes, on many different programs.
Yeah. And even if you try to get around it by saying, well, Romans 5:12 is talking about just people death. The fossil record, according to evolutionists, we've got people that were
true humans,
yep, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years before Adam sinned. There's no way you can fit over 100,000 years, somehow into the biblical chronology. So it just doesn't work. You can go to creation.com/billions, and it'll give you a good article that really gets into the meat and potatoes of that and why the idea of fossils being millions of years old just doesn't fit with the Bible.
Right. Yeah. There's lots there. Now, most people think a fossil, an impression, a cast, an outline, a remnant, a track of an animal or plant must be millions of years old because it's been turned to stone. The organic material has been replaced with minerals, and that happens over a long period of time.
Right, but evolutionists like Dr. Phil Curry, for example, he said things like this: bones do not have to be turned into stone to be fossils, and usually most of the original bone is still present in a dinosaur fossil. Now, he's an evolutionist, but he's studied dinosaurs and fossils to a great degree.
Yes. Right. Do we have any examples of that?
Right.
Of something that obviously Dr. Curry has thought of examples? Well, yes, we do. We have MOR 555 here. This is nicknamed Wankel Rex after its discoverer, Kathy Wankel. It's a 90% complete, very, very complete Tyrannosaurus fossil. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Mary Schweitzer, a famous paleontologist, has described it this way: an exceptionally well-preserved specimen of the Tyrannosaurid dinosaur Tyrannosaurus rex shows little evidence of permineralization or other diagenetic effects. Most fossils show signs of sediment infilling or secondary mineral deposition, but certain specimens can show little evidence of diagenic change. What does diagenic mean? Here we've got a dictionary definition. The sum of the physical, chemical, and biological changes that take place in sediments as they become consolidated into rocks, including compaction, cementation, but excluding weathering and metamorphic changes.
Right, so in other words, MOR 555 is a well-preserved fossil with almost no mineral petrification. It's nearly pure bone. And Dr. Curry gives another example of this when he says dinosaurs in Alberta, Canada, were encased in ironstone nodules shortly after being buried, and he says this: the nodules prevented water from invading the bones, which for all intents and purposes cannot be distinguished from modern bone. So wait a sec. We've got dinosaur bone that can't be distinguished from modern bone. The natural conclusion is that it is modern bone.
That's the natural conclusion. That's right. But of course, dinosaurs are supposed to have lived millions of years ago and died millions of years ago.
Yep.
But in this particular case that Dr. Curry talks about here, the water has been prevented from entering the bones. So
But where the dinosaur bone has been prevented from being permineralized, one would expect that over millions of years, even if it was locked away from any kind of bacterial activity or anything like that, just the laws of thermodynamics would say it would have disintegrated.
Absolutely. Would break down the bone.
That's right. And yet there they are. Bone, looks like modern bone in dinosaurs supposedly 60 million years old. The fossils actually show the Bible's right.
That's right.
In the early 90s, researchers from Montana State University made a startling discovery. Inspecting a piece of T-Rex bone under a microscope, they could hardly believe their eyes. They could see dinosaur red blood cells. This discovery prompted lead scientist Dr. Mary Schweitzer to say, "It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone." But of course I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, "The bones after all are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long?" In a Discover magazine article, Dr. Schweitzer explained further her surprise. If you take a blood sample and stick it on a shelf, you have nothing recognizable in about a week. So why would there be anything left in dinosaurs? Such a response is understandable, considering that she thinks dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. But surely such data suggests it wasn't that long ago.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Welcome back to Creation Magazine Live. If you just tuned in, we're talking about fossils and how those are evidence for creation and not for millions of years. Now here's a definition of what a fossil is from the American Geological Institute. The remains of traces of animals or plants which have been preserved by natural causes in the Earth's crust.
Sounds good to me.
So far, so good.
Yep.
But interestingly, that's not where the definition ends. Have a look at this. Exclusive of organisms which have been buried since the beginning of historic time.
So this is a very self-serving definition, because then what's that mean from the creationist viewpoint? There's no such thing as a fossil.
There aren't any fossils.
I mean, and I've actually seen people kind of argue this way, and it's like, well, we're going to define something this way that excludes you, and then the fossils prove that you're wrong. It's like,
yeah.
What does that mean? I mean, most fossils are a result of Noah's flood. That's what creationists would believe, right? So that was certainly within historic time.
Sure.
And you know, if you want to see an article just talking more about this, it's called "A Fossil is a Fossil is a Fossil," right? And you can find that at creation.com/fossil for more information. But the remains of living things can become fossilized in a short period of time. Even evolutionists admit that.
Yes, Dr. Phil Curry, who's a famous, he's not a creationist, he's an evolutionist, he said this: the amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized or fossilized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of weeks. The preservation of soft tissues in some dinosaurs also suggests that, under exceptional circumstances, fossilization can occur within days.
Here you go.
Incredible.
So actually, Dr. Curry's research indicates that the definition from the American Geological Institute is actually incorrect.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Yep.
Now, here we have an example.
Here's an interesting example.
Yeah, there's a really interesting fossil. It's actually a teddy bear fossil. They lived millions of years ago. It's been completely encased in rock. It's obviously not millions of years old. And this comes from Knaresborough. And that's a town some 21 kilometers or 13 miles west of York, England. And there's a small waterfall there called the Petrifying Well, or the Dripping Well. And it's been a tourist attraction since 1630. Its water originates underground and has a high mineral content. As the water splashes onto the hanging objects that you can see here, the mineral calcite, the calcium carbonate, is deposited along with small amounts of other minerals. Gradually, these deposits build up and coat the object with a crust of rock. The time needed for petrification depends on the size and porosity of the object. Small teddy bears like this take between 3 and 5 months.
Now here the rock is formed on the surface of the bear. It hasn't penetrated very much inside, but in other fossils, mineral deposits normally inside the bone,
Yep.
but that's not always the case, as we've seen. Sometimes minerals are prevented from entering the bones. Now, for more information on these teddy bears, you can go to creation.com/teddy and see more information there.
Now, another startling example of unfossilized dinosaur bones comes from Alaska, and Dr. Phil Curry describes the find like this. He says, an even more spectacular example was found on the north shore of Alaska, where many thousands of bones lack any significant degree of permineralization. The bones look and feel like old cow bones, and the discoverers of the site did not report it for 20 years because they assumed they were bison, not dinosaur bones.
Incredible. So we've got several examples here highlighted by evolutionary paleontologists of unfossilized dinosaur bones.
Right.
Incredible.
So according to what most evolutionists teach and what most people have understood, let's just summarize here. According to Dr. Phil Curry, according to Dr. Mary Schweitzer, famous evolutionary paleontologist,
yes,
most fossil dinosaur bones still contain the original bone. Unfossilized dinosaur bones are sometimes found looking and feeling like fresh bones. Even when heavily permineralized, fossilized, this does not need to require more than a few weeks. So the creation fossil flood scenario for fossilization would allow, many centuries for permineralization to happen. I mean, this totally supports what the Bible says.
It fits very well with the Bible's history, with what the Bible tells us about when God created, about a global flood, which would be perfect conditions for fossilizing things and for more minerals in the water and those conditions that Dr. Curry was talking about.
And it should encourage people that this death that's recorded happened after Adam's sin, not before. Stay tuned.
For a more in-depth understanding of topics relating to the creation-evolution debate, the Journal of Creation contains peer-reviewed research papers that support the biblical account of creation, the flood and the fall. One subscriber said, "I always assumed that this journal would be too academic for me." Not so. I am a Christian with a very inquiring mind. With each issue, I find powerful articles that open doors and shine light on my understanding of the world. Each Journal of Creation is more than 120 pages and published 3 times a year. To subscribe, visit creation.com.
Welcome back. In this episode, we're talking about fossils and how they support the Bible's account of a global flood, etc. Now, here's a really interesting information. In 1999 in Peru, 346 whales were found within a 1.5 kilometer squared, which is like 370 acre area, buried in an 80 meter, which is 260 feet, thick layer of sedimentary rock called diatomite. That's in the Pisco formation, they call
Peru.
it.
Here's a definition of diatomite. Diatomite is known as diatomaceous earth. It is naturally occurring fossilized remains of diatoms. Diatoms are single-celled aquatic algae. These are plants. These microscopic algae have the capability of extracting silica from the water to produce their skeletal structure. Diatomite is a nearly pure sedimentary deposit consisting almost entirely of silica. The Greeks first used diatomite over 2,000 years ago in pottery and brick.
Right. Now, if you missed that from the data here, this is almost a whale per acre. 346 whales, 370 acres. So a whale per acre buried in it 260 foot of layers.
Dead plants.
Right. Now today when diatoms die, their silica skeletons accumulate on the ocean floor. And 1 gram of diatomite may contain up to 400 million skeletons. So we're talking about a lot of dead plants here.
Dead little guys, yeah.
Now here are what living diatoms look like under the microscope. And diatomite sediment normally accumulates slowly. Only a few centimeters per 1,000 years is what we can measure, right? And even when the rate is higher, such as in some shallow water areas, accumulation is still slow. For example, in the fjords of British Columbia, diatoms and clay accumulate at about 2.5 up to 5 millimeters per year. So that's 0.2 inches. It's still not a great rate. So the question is,
how it builds up today, yeah.
How'd you get all that stuff there?
And also when whales die, when a whale carcass sinks to the bottom, it's scavenged, and the scavengers attack and colonize the rotting flesh.
Right.
And in their quest for food, the scavengers will churn up the surrounding sediment.
Right. However, in Peru, the fossilized whales and diatoms were well preserved, and the whale skeletons are mostly intact. So that there's no evidence of normal decay, wormholes, barnacle incrustations, or just general degradation overall. So neither was there any sign that that organisms had stirred up the sediment or anything like that. The question becomes, how could that happen under naturalistic, normal conditions, I guess we could say.
Slow burial.
Slow burial. That's,
In addition to that, the whale skeletons were partially mineralized, and baleen from 5 of the whales was actually preserved. Baleen forms a comb-like structure in a whale's mouth that you can see here that filters its food. This is remarkable because it's softer than bone. It's basically the consistency of our fingernails. It's that type of material.
Exactly. So there's no doubt that these well-preserved whales in diatomite indicate rapid burial, not slow burial. And that contradicts one of the ruling principles of modern geology, which is uniformitarianism, right?
Right.
That the rocks formed slowly in the past, similar to what we observe in the present. And interpreted according to that principle, the whales were buried over a period of 2 million years ago, 2 million years, about 10 million years ago. It took 2 million years to build. It's not going to work, right?
It doesn't work. Certainly the baleen wouldn't have survived. The carcasses wouldn't be intact. They'd be disarticulated. They wouldn't still all be together. Most of them are articulated skeletons. They're still, all the bones are still attached to each other.
And the fact that 80 meters of sediment buried 346 whales within months or weeks creates a problem for those who believes in millions of years. So you look at it the other way, right?
Yeah.
So where do you put the time? There's nowhere to put it in the rocks.
A whale graveyard is a far more adequate explanation. It fits within a biblical timescale. These whales were killed. There was some kind of a mass kill event. In addition, the team found other sea creatures with these whales. They found in the deposit sharks, fish, turtles, seals, and porpoises, and land animals such as ground sloths and penguins. So go figure.
Right. And there's another puzzle for evolutionists, of course.
It is, yeah.
So 346 well-preserved fossil whales found in Peru. It graphically illustrates the accuracy of biblical history when you really think about it. And this remarkable find points to a rapid catastrophic burial. It's consistent with the time frame of the Bible, which is a time frame covering thousands of years, not millions of years. So again, you go into the field, what does it show? Supports what the Bible says. And we'll be back in just a moment.
When the BBC produced the Walking with the Dinosaur series several years ago, they had to search the globe for appropriate filming locations. But whenever they discovered an otherwise suitable site, the ground was inevitably covered in grass. And back in the year 1999, that was an evolutionary impossibility. You see, until recently, most scientists thought that grasses first evolved around 55 million years ago, long after the supposed extinction of the dinosaurs. But since then, studies of fossilized dinosaur dung have shown that not only did dinosaurs and grass live at the same time, but dinosaurs actually ate it. We often hear dogmatic statements about what did or didn't happen millions of years ago. But it's important to realize that these statements involve lots of assumptions, are often based on fragmentary evidence, and can be totally overturned when new evidence comes to light.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
All right, welcome back. If you just tuned in, we're talking about a creationist, a Christian understanding of the fossils. Now, most people assume, or they think that the fossil record is mostly, dinosaurs and vertebrate animals and so on.
Well, that's the exciting stuff.
Yeah, that's the exciting stuff, but the composition is actually quite different from what we are led to believe.
Yeah, here's an actual breakdown of the fossil record, or an estimate of it anyway. They say that 95% of the fossil record consists of shallow marine organisms, such as corals and shellfish, things like that.
95%?
95%.
Yeah.
Of the remaining 5%, 95% are the algae in plant, tree fossils, including vegetation that now makes up the trillions of tons of coal, and all the other invertebrate fossils, which would include insects, etc. Then vertebrates, 5% of 5%, which is 0.25% of the entire fossil record. That includes fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and other dinosaurs.
So that's 1/4%.
That's a very small percent that
Wow.
those things are represented in. And of that, you've only got 1% of that, 0.0025%, that are vertebrate fossils that consist of more than a single bone. That's why it's so exciting if you go out and you find a T-Rex and it's fully articulated, or most of the bones are there. I think they've got maybe 12 or 13 very complete T-Rexes around the world. That's why it's such a big deal, because you don't generally find that much stuff left.
But the fossil record is it's primarily a record of marine organisms, and the flood was a marine catastrophe.
Right.
The fossils are a good sort of result of a marine catastrophe like the flood.
Yeah, you can go to creation.com/human fossils, human-fossils, to get some understanding too. People often have the question, well, what about the human fossils? As we can see, even finding a fossil with more than one bone is a big deal. But anyway, you can go there for more information on that.
Now, most of you would probably be familiar with something like this. It's the geologic timescale, a geologic column, and you can see here different ages of things depending on the fossils. The rocks have been assigned different ages. And the thing is, there's nowhere in the world where you can find a complete geologic column. People think, well, I saw this in a textbook, I must be able to go out and dig in my backyard and I'd find this sequence of rocks exactly as you see there. But that's not what we find. That's
right. Yeah, in many cases, we can examine what science has discovered, and it actually fits very neatly into biblical history, as we can see from the fossils that we've been talking about here earlier. But with the geologic column, it's not that easy. Some creationists doubt that it even exists at all.
Right. Yep.
But most would agree that there's certainly a sequence to the fossil record. We'd say there's a general a pattern to the fossil record. It's not completely random, which is kind of what you'd expect if there'd been a global flood.
Right, because moving water has a tremendous ability to sort things by size, by shape, and by buoyancy. So we'd expect certain grain sizes to be all sorted together if there was, continent-wide flooding and water moving over the continents.
And you would certainly expect that the organisms that would get buried quickly would be the things that are already in the oceans and things that can't move real quickly. So clams don't run real fast, and they're there, and so that's what would have been buried first. You'd expect that general pattern with the sorting and stuff. Now, what doesn't seem possible, however, is to take the geologic column that we see in textbooks that doesn't exist in reality anyway, not completely, and simply trying to compress that to fit into what the flood. It's pretty hard to just make this exact comparison.
There's no one-to-one comparison. Okay, the Cretaceous is always, it happened here in the flood or whatever. There's nothing like that. But
now, Dr. Taz Walker, a geologist on staff with our Australian office of CMI, he's actually developed a geologic model to help Christians really understand the Earth's rocks and what we're actually looking at here. So.
Right. Now, this model is summarized by a couple of charts, and you can, we've got printouts here. You can go to biblicalgeology.net and print out these charts. Now, starting with page 1 there on the right-hand side, you can see the time scale. And that starts with creation at the bottom, and then that's a short time period, and then a larger area there, pre-flood, where not a lot of geology happened, there's not much going on. Then the flood is another short time frame, about a year long. And then after that, a lot of time going from the flood until now, basically, where, again, very little geology has happened.
Right. Now, if you move over to the next section, you can see the rock scale, which shows a basic biblical geologic column, and roughly the volume of rock produced at each stage. So if you begin at the bottom with the primordial phase, note that the scale extends right to the center of the earth. This is the huge amount of rock that was supernaturally created by God, either initially covered with water on day 1 or created on day 3. And then you see the ensuing, the derivative, the biotic, and they relate to the geologic activity happening during the creation week, of course.
Right. And on page 2, you can see the description of some of those layers there. And that's a good kind of summary of a creationist, a flood-based understanding of the rocks. And we encourage you to go to that website, biblicalgeology.net. And given the biblical history, we can see, we can understand how animals can be buried quickly and preserving them in the way we find them today.
Creation Ministries International focuses on the Bible's first book, Genesis, and the creation evolution issue. Many of our speakers are scientists with PhDs who, before joining CMI, were employed in various scientific fields. Creation Ministries speakers go to churches, equipping and encouraging people with the message of the truth and authority of the Bible and its relevance to the real world. To locate upcoming CMI events or inquire about booking a speaker into your church, visit creation.com.
Well, welcome back to Creation Magazine Live. Here we're going to be discussing some feedback that we received from an article that was written. Gary Bates had written an article called "Did God Create Life on Other Planets?" And this person wrote in. And it sounded like they were kind of struggling to understand how Bible and science could fit together, or perhaps not trying hard enough. But anyway, here's what the person said. The more I read the Bible and try to rationalize what's in it, with what science is discovering about our universe, the harder it is to believe in the book.
And we can just pause right there and say, well, okay, here's the first problem. His definition of science really is naturalism.
Right.
And if you're going to take the definition, that if you're going to say, well, everything is natural, then of course it's going to disagree with creation, because creation involves the supernatural.
Right.
So you're not going to have a harmonization there if you've excluded supernatural explanations for how the universe could have got here in the first place.
Right. As a matter of fact, even to say something like, science disagrees with what's in God's book, really what you're saying is, I've accepted secular interpretations of facts that have been interpreted as evidence for evolution.
And it is an interpretation.
That's right.
That's the thing.
And that contradicts what the Bible says.
Right.
Well, yeah, but you can take those facts and you can interpret them in a better way, and produce evidence that's actually in support of the Bible. So
Right.
just don't go into the enemy's camp and take what they're feeding you, so to speak.
Yeah.
He said, I wish God would come back down to earth and just clarify everything up for humanity.
Yeah, well, here's Gary's response. He did already and explained it to us in his book, The Bible. It seems that rejecting the Bible because of your science, so-called, is preventing you from seeing the big picture of the marvelous gospel that the Bible is all about.
I actually went down and sat with a group of atheists one time, and I asked one of the atheists on this panel, I said, what would prove, what would you accept as proof that, and he said, well, if somebody came back to life. And I nearly fell back in my chair, because I was like, isn't that the whole, Jesus came back to life. That's the kind of thing. But you see, in a sense, this person, it's almost like you read the letter and it's like, are you really trying that hard to hold on to your faith?
Do you really want answers to this question, or are you just looking to nitpick? And yeah.
And then he said, his book is so old. This was one of the comments from...
Yes, his book is so old. And Gary's response was, that's a good thing. It's a strength of it, not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Because it tells us about history, about our origins, what went wrong. Gary says, it's interesting, too, that the Bible has been described as the most accurate historical book ever written when it comes to archaeology. For example, see the walls of Jericho. And you can do a search on the walls of Jericho and get that article. So if one can verify such historical claims in one area to be true, then it might be a good reason to accept its historical claims in other areas, like origins, for example.
Right. So again, if you really want to, uphold your faith, or get information about how to do that, the first thing you have to understand is not to accept interpretations that are specifically designed in a way to counteract what the Bible clearly says, a naturalistic, evolutionary time frame. So anyway, hopefully that was helpful to you, and we'll see you next time on Creation Magazine Live.